Welcome to the Center for Climate and Security's Climate and Security podcast. Creative name, I know. I am your host, Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. Twice a month, we will be bringing you exclusive dialogues with the world's leading thinkers, researchers, civil servants, and military personnel who work at the nexus of security and climate change. I'll be asking these folks to share with us their stories and their visions on what we can do to collectively prepare in this time of unprecedented risks, particularly climate change. Today's podcast guest is John Conger. John is the director of the Center for Climate and Security. He was previously the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations, and Environment. And before that, he spent about 12 years on Capitol Hill. He is one of the nation's leading experts on the intersection of climate change and national security, especially as it relates to the military mission. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here.
So John, what do you believe are the greatest threats that climate change poses to national security?
Well, we spent a lot of time on this when I was in the Pentagon, and I think that the challenges and the threats really fall into three main categories. The first one is how it affects the DoD's mission today and its ability to do its job. The second is what kind of new missions that it's going to give DoD to do in the future. As the world changes, the situations are going to change, and fundamentally different requirements are going to be asked of the Department of Defense because of climate change. The third category I would call the threat multiplier category. It's the effect that climate change can have on global stability, and I can go into each one of those in some detail if you
sure,
like.
Sure, please do. So let's talk a little bit about being able to do its job currently.
So as we think about the ways that climate change affects the DoD's ability to do its job currently, I'd say there are probably two main pieces of that. One is infrastructure impacts, and another one is readiness impacts. From an infrastructure perspective, you have sea level rise, which causes flooding at bases. When you have a flooded runway and you can't fly airplanes out of that runway, it has a significant impact.
Sure.
You have issues. So DoD has a lot of bases. DoD has bases across the world in every climate zone. They have bases on the coast, they have bases inland, and they all face different problems. And climate change can affect each one in different ways. If you think about bases in Alaska, for example, just this year, the Air Force requested funding for a replacement facility for an F-35 maintenance facility because the old one, and it can't be that old because we haven't had F-35s for that long, right. Because of permafrost thaw and because it wasn't built with a sound enough foundation with that in mind, the foundation cracked and they can't use the building anymore.
What do you mean by permafrost, though?
So in Alaska, or in the high north, there's permafrost. There's basically super hard ground underneath the regular ground that you walk on. Now I won't pretend to be a scientist, but essentially what the net effect is that when that hard layer thaws because the temperatures are no longer sub-freezing, the ground settles and becomes a lot softer, and so what that can do to buildings is the foundation, suddenly it's like you're built on sand, and foundations of buildings, if they're not built correctly, can crack.
So what you're saying is this ground that has been frozen for as long as it's been frozen is now all of a sudden in recent history started to thaw.
Yes.
And that's actually impacting the infrastructure that's been built on top of it.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. And so that is an example that is current and is part of this year's budget request because they have to build a new building, a replacement building. That is an example where now it impacts F-35 maintenance.
Wow.
For example. But these problems happen all across the enterprise, and they're going to start happening more and more. One example that we see coming up, there was a report that DoD put out within the last couple months, and it talked about sea level rise and the impact on islands in the Pacific. Now, we have bases in the Pacific, and we have bases on islands in the Pacific. We just spent $1 billion on a new radar facility to track objects in space and to help with missile defense. And we just built a $1 billion radar facility on an island that now DoD studies are saying because of sea level rise and because of the saltwater intrusion into their freshwater sources, won't support human habitation past as soon as 2030, maybe a little bit, might last a little bit longer. But the point is that that's the kind of information that you know you're not going to have fresh water on an island anymore, that you're going to have to either ship it in or create some sort of a desalinization plant. That is the kind of thing you want to know before you spend $1 billion on a new facility. And so whether it's an island in the Pacific, it's structures on the permafrost in Alaska, or if it's coastal facilities in a place like Norfolk, where they're building their piers higher because of sea level rise today. All of those impacts affect DoD's ability to do its job.
Right.
Now, is it the only thing that affects DoD's ability to do its job? No, but it does affect it, and it is a lot easier to reduce risk when you acknowledge up front the risk exists and you try to work around it.
So you're talking about really proactively managing these risks that you're saying are not just impacting current missions, but future missions.
Yes. Now, the other piece of sort of the today job that is the readiness impact. We want to talk about when you have climate changes and when you have higher temperatures and when you have drought, it affects your ability to train. There are these things called black flag days, which is essentially when it's too hot, when it's above 90 degrees, they don't make the soldiers run out, do training outside with long runs.
That's the cutoff, 90 degrees?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
And so with the increasing number of 90-degree days, this affects the training syllabus. It affects their ability to get the troops through training with the training that they require.
Sure.
Similarly, there are bases out west where we do live fire training, where you actually use munitions that blow up. If you're in a drought, the use of live fire is constrained because they're afraid they're going to start a wildfire. So as a result, that also impedes your ability to get through all of the required training. Now, can they work around that? Well, sometimes they can. But the point is that this is a climate effect and a climate change effect that is increasingly impacting DoD's ability to do its job.
Right.
It's very straightforward. And so the question then is, are there practical things that you can do to mitigate it? And sometimes there are. Sometimes there aren't. And the question is, how much are they going to have to do workarounds in order to be able to accommodate this? So that's sort of the first category of items.
The current state of affairs.
Current job types of things.
Sure.
Those are a sampling. There are probably some more that I could rattle off,
Yeah.
but that'll give you a picture.
Yeah, these are some great examples. Thank you for sharing these with us. It seems as though the amount of money that is being allocated towards addressing these current needs, how does that fit into the budgets that you oversaw while you were in your tenure?
Okay. Yeah, no, so I would say this. One of the conversations I used to have with the White House all the time was that it's not about requiring more money to deal with climate change. It's about how you spend the money you get. So there were conversations about these huge green climate funds that the Obama White House wanted to request of the Republican Congress. And I was a little bit skeptical because the fact of the matter was that Congress was not receptive and they would probably just cut it, and they did. And instead, I had, on average, an $8 to $10 billion military construction budget every year that I was managing.
Wow, yeah.
And wouldn't it make more sense, rather than asking for more money, to change the way you spend that money?
Sure.
And to put new rules in place. And so what I did was I put out memos saying, minimize construction in floodplains, because you know it's only going to flood more. Or when you have to, because, in all honesty, most Navy bases are on the coast, right? And so you're going to be in floodplains and you're going to have certain parts of the base impacted. So when you have to put a building in a particular place, then outline your mitigation plan.
Right.
Don't put your backup power in the basement where it's going to flood.
Right.
Don't put your servers in the basement. There are things that you can do, acknowledging the fact that the building's going to flood, that allows you to minimize the operational impact.
So what was that like? Was it easy to make this case? Was it frustrating when you got pushback? Did you get pushback?
I didn't get any pushback. People, it's amazing what you can do when you don't ask for new money.
Right.
and frankly, in a budget capped environment, we were dealing with sequestration, keep in mind.
Sure.
So there were a lot of cuts across the enterprise and a lot of prioritization. I was managing an installations enterprise that was close to $1 trillion, okay, of value. That's the sum total of all the buildings. We weren't maintaining those buildings adequately. We didn't have the money to maintain those buildings adequately. And I testified before Congress more than once that we knew we were underfunding maintenance, and we were doing it on purpose because we were in a zero-sum environment, limited by sequestration. And frankly, funding troops in the field was more important than funding facilities. And readiness degrades faster than facilities do. And so I could take some risk there. We did it on purpose, and we're still doing it because there's just not enough money. People say, oh, DOD's got so much money. Well, they do, but they get asked to do a lot of things.
Sure.
And so the scale of the enterprise requires the funding, that they get, and then some.
That is the prevailing perception, it seems, in the public that Americans have, is that there's so much money there. Everything is more or less maintained.
There is a lot of money there.
well, you use the word trillion, so
yes,
that's a lot of
money. But you ask them to do a lot of things.
That's true.
And so, somebody could give you $1 million, and that would seem like a lot of money. And then they'd say, here's this $5 million list of tasks you have to do. And then all of a sudden, $1 million doesn't seem like a lot.
Sure.
It's a question of balance, not a question of sheer amount.
Right. So then, to what extent is this budget allocated towards the current mission completion versus future missions? Are these two separate budgets altogether?
So again, let's not talk about it in terms of budgets, right? So there are lots there's a lot of resources devoted to current missions, as well there should be.
Right.
Not a lot of people know that half of the DoD budget is for personnel.
Right.
It pays. So we didn't cover this in the bio part, but I spent the last 14 months at DoD as the Deputy Comptroller. So I had all the money, sort of. And
there's a reason I'm interviewing you, John.
Yes. and so as such, it's important to recognize that fully half of the $600 or $700 billion goes to pay military and civilian pay and benefits.
Right.
And so it's the number of people you have that drives the scope of the DoD. People talk about the big hardware systems, and they are all a lot of money. But as you compare the percentage of the enterprise, they're smaller than the personnel costs.
Sure.
So let's think about it in that context. As you think about how much it costs to deal with climate change, the first thing you have to do is figure out the scope of your problem. To stop, when you're in a hole, stop digging. So the new things you build, you want to build them in a resilient way.
Right.
As you plan your bases, you want to plan them in a resilient way. You want to think about your training requirements and figure out how you're going to use those ranges in a resilient way. How do you do it such that the climate change impacts aren't going to impact you, or you get to figure out how to work around them? That's not necessarily more money. It might be.
Right.
So that sort of leads to a set of questions that Congress asked last year. Congress put in a report in their defense authorization bill that essentially said to the DoD, we want you, well, first thing it did, which was, as an aside, it declared climate change to be a direct threat to the national security of the United States.
Yep.
I think this is, we're going on lots of tangents. We're going to come back to the main line of questioning. But I think it's important for the folks watching this to realize that the Republican Congress passed a bill, and passed as part of their defense authorization bill, a statement that said climate change is a direct threat to the national security of the United States. That was sustained in a vote on the House floor. It was accepted in a conference with the Senate and signed by President Trump.
Yep.
So, lest we think that everything is changing in one direction because of the change in political leadership, there are certain things that are still accepted to a degree.
So please do expand on that. We are going off on a tangent a bit, but I think this is going to be very interesting for those who are maybe hearing this for the first time or curious, since you have been engaged with both administrations to some extent, more on the periphery now. But what are the differences you're really seeing then? What is it that we should be concerned about or should pay more attention to?
Well, and I think as you look at the dynamics of climate change and politics and that intersection, one of the things that people have a tendency to push back on is they look at that and they say, I don't want to change the way I live my life. I don't want to use less energy. I don't want to emit less carbon. I don't want to have to think about that. I understand those dynamics, and it makes things harder to pass. You also have interests like who are based on emissions, whether they're the coal industry or the oil industry or whatever, and have resisted climate change to a degree. So in that environment, when you start talking about emissions limitations and carbon fees and taxes and things like that impact the way people behave, they're a bit more resistant, and you get a much more crisp partisan split.
Right.
But when you start talking about, hey, this stuff is happening, can you please let me deal with it? This is not about preventing climate change. It is about adapting to climate change. It's about if I have floods, can I buy some sandbags? You know, these are the kinds of things DoD wants to be able to do. If I have construction standards, can I use ones that recognize the fact that it floods more here than it used to? And those are easier questions. Resilience, the DoD is spending a lot of time in this administration on energy resilience. How do you make sure that a military base is able to continue operations when there's a power outage? We spent a lot of time on that. We spent time on it in the last administration. They're focusing a lot on it right now, and I think that's healthy.
Yep.
They are trying to figure in what causes power outages. Well, big storms do. There are other things that do too, and people are afraid of cyber attacks on the grid, and as well they should be. But as you think about how do you become more resilient, it is a question that is generally, it doesn't make people uncomfortable in the same way. And so you have Republicans and Democrats who are able to come together and pass sensible, pragmatic, common sense, legislation that moves the ball forward on these issues. And so last year when they passed this bill, they leveraged the fact that, Secretary Mattis had said a lot of things recognizing the climate change affects the mission. And he wasn't saying it was his top priority, but he was not going to ignore it. And a lot of his senior leadership took up that signal, and they recognized that this was a real issue, and they weren't going to ignore it.
That might be surprising to folks listening in who think that the administration's stance is delete all things climate change. But here we are with the DoD the top dog saying that that's not the case at all.
Well, and we can all talk about, so again, another tangent.
Please.
We have lots of tangents. At some point, if we tie this all in a bow, I'd be very impressed. So we there was a report that was started in the Obama administration. It was a screening level vulnerability assessment. We had drafted a report, and this was done after I had left the Installations and Environment Office. I sort of started it, but it was finished after I was gone. And they had a report which talked about climate change pretty freely, and it was handed off to the next administration. And ultimately, they issued the report with all the data, but they probably edited the wording, right? And a lot of to-do was made of the fact that they took the words climate change out of a lot of places in the document.
Right.
I mean, if I got handed a document from the previous administration, I'd edit it too. So I recognize that people are concerned, but the report still said the same thing.
Right.
The report still said that bases across the enterprise are being impacted by climate, and lots of different impacts, whether it's drought or sea level rise or a bunch of different things. It talked about all of that stuff. And so I am a little bit more accepting of the fact that they edited the verbiage when in fact the thrust of the report is still the same. And it still sort of highlights the concerns that the DoD has and should have about the issue. And so that report comes out earlier this year. Previous to that report being issued, Congress, in this same thing where they declared climate change a threat, put together a list of requirements for DoD to talk about sort of a climate threat assessment and the vulnerability assessment. And the report they issued this year doesn't quite do all that. It's very cursory, surface level type stuff.
Sure.
But the requirement from Congress was they have to come up with a top 10 list of the most vulnerable installations per military department. Why is that important? That's important because when they issued that report to Congress, That will be a DoD issued report. It will be DoD's lists.
Right.
And so in the future, when we say where we want to pay particular attention, we'll say, well, go to the list DoD came up with, because they're not going to argue with that.
Right.
And then you say, all right, now that I have this list of locations, what are we going to do? Personally, I think that at that point, you have to start building plans at each one of those places, a resilience plan of some sort for, okay, you said these were the most vulnerable places. Well, how do you mitigate the damage?
Right.
Let me give you an example. Some years back, Langley Air Force Base, which is now Joint Base Langley-Eustis, used to have, when there was a significant storm, really bad flooding. And they had a lot of damage done to facilities on the base. This is not far from Norfolk. Same sort of environment, low-lying and flood-prone. They instituted a sandbag plan. This is a sort of baby steps in resilience, right?
Right.
But after they started putting out sandbags when they knew there was going to be a storm, the damage reduced.
Right.
Lo and behold, trying to prevent sustaining damage,
right,
you can prevent it.
Right.
When it started happening often enough that filling sandbags was just too much of a chore and too labor intensive, they started putting in these things called door dams, where you can put a structure, basically an addition to your doorway, and slide in the door dam when you know there's going to be a storm, so you don't have to put up sandbags, and it stops the water from coming in. So they are adapting at that location, and each subsequent adaptation means that less damage is done from the same effect. And so the question you want to ask yourself at those places where DoD says it is the most vulnerable, somebody's going to have to come up with a plan at each one of those locations so that they can minimize the amount of impact that storms or other climate impacts have on the base.
Sure. And are these sort of common sense approaches, these resiliency adaptation measures, are they being shared? Is there communication across different bases, let's say within DoD, across agencies?
I would have to imagine there's some, but I don't know to what extent that's going on right now. Certainly within each service, you're going to have that kind of a conversation going on, because it's the same people that oversee all the bases. I imagine that between the military departments, there's some conversation, but there's still a little bit insular.
Sure.
Right? Not everything is joint.
Right.
And the Navy's going to think the Navy is best, and the Air Force is going to think the Air Force is best, and the Army's going to think the Army's best,
right,
and that's just the way it works. Personalities.
Yeah, we're going to look forward to teasing out the different personalities across all the branches. This is going to be a learning curve for myself and for listeners, I imagine.
Yes.
So let's bring this back to this bow tie.
Yeah, we're going to tie back the tangents. All right.
Yes. So as we're talking about all these measures that are underway at the moment, what about these future impacts we can begin to think about what we can do to prepare?
So as we think about the impacts to sort of the future job list of DoD, there's a couple of things that jump out at me, and there's probably going to be some that I can't predict right now. If you imagine there's going to be more storms, there's going to be more intense storms, there's going to be more requirements on a smaller military to provide assistance, and we provide regular humanitarian assistance, disaster response types of activities internationally. We provide regular defense. It's called defense support for civilian authorities, essentially helping out domestically when there's a storm, and helping out the locals, say for example in Puerto Rico or in Florida or whatever when there's a hurricane.
Sure.
I know personally that when we had Superstorm Sandy, DoD assets were being deployed we were bringing generators in, we were providing a military base footprint to use as staging areas. Those kinds of activities are going to increase if you have an increased number of storms.
Right.
And so that's one set of jobs. But I think actually in this area, the one that is the most significant and the one that is the most accepted is the Arctic. So just recently, the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations from this administration at the Senate Armed Services Committee testified, and they were asked, what has prompted you to revisit your Arctic strategy? Why are you looking at this? And the CNO, the Chief of Navy, the head 4-star of the whole Navy, said, well, the Arctic prompted it. And then the Secretary of the Navy pipes in and says, yeah, the damn thing melted. And what does that mean for the Navy? Well, what it means for the Navy when there's no longer an Arctic covered with ice is that now you have a navigable ocean. That's going to mean more trade activity through that route. That's going to mean more people trying to do resource extraction in that region. And that means that, there's a lot of economic activity. Well, part of the Navy's job is to ensure freedom of the seas. So they're going to need to be able to operate in that region as well. You're going to need, but it's a different requirement for, say, for example, surveillance. The satellites have to be in different orbits to cover that region.
Sure.
Different requirements for communications satellites. You have to think about if the ocean is below freezing because saltwater freezes below freshwater, what does that do to the freshwater systems inside the ships that you're sailing up there? And have you thought about that? And have you made those ships resilient to that particular environment? Do we have the right clothes for our sailors who are sailing in that environment? That kind of thing. And at the same time that we're wrestling with this question about how to operate in an Arctic, Russia and China are both expanding their activities in this region. Russia obviously has a lot of Arctic coastline, and they have a lot of interest in the region, and they are essentially saying, yes, this is ours. But you also have China, who sees this trade route as critical economically, and so they're investing in things like icebreakers. China has more icebreakers than we do. We have Arctic, we have land in the Arctic part of the United States. They don't, but they have more icebreakers than we do. For example, this kind of great power competition and these economic resources at stake mean to me that in the future, and not the far future, but sort of the medium future, the Arctic is going to be an area of much higher activity, and we just have to be ready for it. And the Navy gets that. As we think about climate change, you wonder why the Army or the Navy or the Air Force thinks about it differently. The Navy has more coastal installations, so they're more impacted directly by sea level rise. And the mission up in the Arctic is mostly a Navy mission. There's going to be some Air Force stuff that goes on up there, but think about it as a Navy mission because you're really talking about a new ocean, or at least an uncovered ocean. So the Navy has more of a sense of urgency over this sort of thing because of their job. And so as they think about future missions, the Navy's going to have a lot more to do.
Sure. So we're talking about current missions, the potential risks to the current missions right now, and then new missions, particularly the example you gave with the Navy and the Arctic. So then you also mentioned when we first started chatting about this being a threat multiplier. So you're saying there's even more impacts associated with climate change beyond what all of these things that you've already mentioned?
Right. So around the world, climate change has impacts on different places and in different ways. Droughts in certain regions, for us, a drought in a certain region might have a significant economic impact. But in another country around the world, a drought might mean the difference between life and death for a lot of people. Countries that don't have the economic capacity, or frankly, the competence in government to be able to address those issues and take care of its people. We have seen that around the world, you need a combination of fragile government and a climate stress in order to create conflict of some sort. If you have a climate stress and a fairly secure and stable government, it's less likely to have the kind of dramatic conflict-driven result. Say, for example, in the United States, where you get a hurricane hit and we just spend more money. But if you have a drought in, say, for example, Syria, where and this is an example that's brought up a lot of the time and is a key case. In Syria, they had a combination of factors that led to their civil war. Now, did climate change cause their civil war? I would never make that argument. But did it contribute? Yes. So you had an environment where there were stresses over food supply. You had a huge number of refugees coming from the Iraq War, unemployed people in urban centers. And then in a country where they had made a point of having their food produced domestically and created agricultural regions. And all of a sudden there was a drought. And so all of those internally sourced food supplies dried up. And you had, not only was there a shortage of food, but you had all of these farmers moving to urban areas looking for some sort of a job. And there weren't jobs to be had. And so you had basically a combination of factors which resulted in unemployed people in urban centers with nothing to do. That's not necessarily a recipe for peace. And so those stresses together helped to light the fire underneath the Syrian civil war that our troops are involved in today. And so DoD looks around the world for those potential hotspots and recognizes that climate impact can be a threat multiplier, can essentially pour lighter fluid on a small fire and make it a big fire. It makes bad situations worse. I can come up with lots of analogies.
Sure.
So you get that Syria is one place. There's a lot of regions in Africa. Our troops are deployed to Niger. Why? Well, a lot of it's because there are terrorist groups in the region. But why are there terrorist groups in the region? Well, part of it is that there are economic problems in that region that allow those terrorist groups and those violent extremist organizations to recruit those people who are maybe economically dissatisfied, newly unemployed. The Lake Chad has dried up significantly, and while I'm sure that has a variety of impacts, one of the impacts it has had is it has had taken away the river economy that was once there, and as a consequence, you have a lot more unemployment and a lot more economic distress, and that is a fertile ground for recruitment. And that's the way the military looks at it. And I want to be careful not to cast all of the victims of climate change as villains. But if you want if DoD pays attention to the latter part, there are other agencies that assist those who are in distress. But DoD has to pay attention to those kinds of militant activities that it needs to prepare against. And so we have troops deployed to that region.
So those who might be skeptical of that relationship, potentially, we're not saying that it causes, any one impact causes this type of outcome, but there is some relationship between this desperation or the socioeconomic strife that is then fueling this instability, regional instability that the DoD is very aware of and very tapped into. So the American public and the global listeners to this podcast how should they feel knowing that this is something that the DoD is recognizing, is paying attention to, and is on top of, would you say?
Yeah. Well, I think that's fair. I think that they probably don't want the issue of development or assistance to those less advantaged nations to be militarized. I don't think it is. All I'm saying is DoD recognizes the phenomenon, are taking care of their part of the job in trying to pay attention to the potential of conflict and threats. The whole of government is required, and Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, said this. The whole of government approach is required because he doesn't want the job to have to do development assistance either. Right. I don't think anybody wants the DoD to have to do that. That's other people's job, and other people are doing that job. But so it's not just a DoD response to climate insecurity. It's a whole of government type of issue. But DoD is paying attention to its part of it, certainly, and it is not going to ignore it.
So what do we need in terms of support to help these missions, the current missions, the future missions? What can those listening to this podcast do in regards to supporting these initiatives that are coming from the top?
This isn't entirely a civilian-driven enterprise, but where civilians do have an impact is their elected representatives that they employ, right? And if you understand that there is a new center being created in Congress, right? This is no longer a left versus right issue. Certain climate change conversations might be a left versus right issue, but when you start talking about the intersection between climate and national security, that this sensible center is being built there where people accept the fact that DoD needs to be able to do its job, and they accept the fact that certain things impact DoD. And when you talk to your members of Congress and your elected representatives and you say, all right, well, you might not be sympathetic to certain climate change policies that limit emissions or anything like that. I understand that. But at least let the DoD do its job. That kind of support for a sensible center is I would say almost a confidence building measure. It is a wonderful thing when members of Congress from the Republican and Democratic parties can actually have conversations together and be on the same side of an issue. And there are fewer and fewer of those these days, and that is a challenge that they all have. But when they find something that they can agree on and come together on, I think that's really helpful. There is a group in the House of Representatives called the Climate Solutions Caucus, and it is one of the most unique organizations that I've ever seen. I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time,
right?
And I had never seen this set of rules set for joining a caucus.
Right.
If you join the Climate Solutions Caucus, you can only join if you bring somebody from the other party with you.
Right. Very unique.
So they have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and they have waiting lists of people who want to join, but they have to find a partner.
Right.
And so it brings Republicans and Democrats together in the same organization to start thinking about a problem set that they all want to work on together that impacts us all. And so that is an example about how climate change can be a bipartisan issue. And climate and national security is an issue set that I think sort of sits in that space even more so, right? There was a vote in the House of Representatives last year on this issue where 46 Republicans joined Democrats. There might be another issue where 46 Democrats will join Republicans. But the point is that you're looking for those crossover issues where people aren't just voting party line, but are voting for the sensible center.
Right.
And national security is one of the spaces where you have a lot of bipartisan support historically.
Right.
The defense bills usually pass with overwhelming margins from both Republicans and Democrats. And in having a space where climate change can find its niche in there, I think is super useful. And so, creating that safe space and telling your members of Congress, whatever you believe on climate change, whatever you believe on national security, where they come together, let's let our troops be able to do their job.
Right, because ultimately what's at risk is being able to complete the missions currently,
yes,
future missions, and then of course all of these additional ripple effects that we may not have known that there was a relationship between, but potentially there really could be. And those are where our troops are going potentially underprepared, and we want to make sure that we give them the support they have from back home.
That's right. And it's not necessarily earth-shattering things that are required. I mean, part of the reason that this is someplace where both parties can find some common ground is because the kinds of things they're asking, the kinds of things they're trying to accomplish are the steps you need in order to prepare the ground. If you have a problem that's not going to be fully emerged for a long number of years, say decades,
right,
then it's a challenge. But if you wait 30 years and you didn't do anything, then it's a crisis.
Sure.
And so you want to attack the issue while it's a challenge. And the actions that are required 30 years in advance of the full emergence of a problem are smaller and easier to accept than those that are going to be required when it's a crisis. And I'm not, there's plenty of places where you look at it and say, well, this looks like a crisis to me today.
Right.
And there are. But the things that we're talking in terms of the military probably aren't so much, right? They are more challenges than they are crises right now inside the DoD enterprise. And that's a good thing. And it gives us time to do what we need to do in a thoughtful, sort of pragmatic approach to this problem.
And what will your role be in this as you go forward from the career that you've already had to where you are now as the director for the Center for Climate and Security? How do you plan to address these challenges before they turn into crises?
Well, the center's role is educational in many respects. Our job is to talk to Congress, talk to the administration, and frankly, to talk to folks around the country about this problem, to make sure they understand the impact that climate change is having on DoD, and then to have a proportional response. So a lot of this is educational. A lot of times we have this conversation, people say, I didn't really think about it that way. Every time that light bulb turns on is a success story. When you can have that light bulb turn on inside a member of Congress's head, that's a really big success story. Right. And I think all the light bulbs are already on in the Pentagon.
Right.
And they all get it. And so then the question is, how do you move forward?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Your contributions to this podcast as we're kicking off this series of conversations with some of the leading thinkers is very much appreciated. The listeners will appreciate it as well.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening today to the Climate and Security Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, we'd love to hear from you. Please tweet me at Sweta C or the Center's Twitter at the Center for Climate and Security. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, also please subscribe, write a review on iTunes, share widely, and finally, consider donating to the podcast from the Center of Climate and Security's podcast page, www.climateendsecurity.org/podcast, and you can click on Make a Donation. We will continue this series of conversations with some of the most prolific and dedicated folks in the space. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you, and please tune in again for the next episode of the Climate and Security Podcast.